Istanbul? You want to go to Istanbul? Hello and welcome. Welcome to Input English. In this episode, we join Irene and Jim as they're planning their next trip. As you may know from previous episodes, Jim spent many years as a retired widower, so he traveled a lot by himself. He developed his own traveling style, and he was very comfortable traveling in that manner. Irene, on the other hand, spent many years in what she calls her spinster years. That is, she was an unmarried school teacher, and although she didn't want to be called a spinster, she would apply that term to herself in a lighthearted way. So she referred to the time in her life before she met Jim as her spinster years. At the time of this episode, they've been together for a while. They're now very comfortable with each other, and it's time to plan a travel adventure. Jim has proposed that they go to Istanbul. He has been there several times before, and he would like to share this with Irene. Irene had read about Istanbul years ago and was always interested in that exotic place. She thought, so much history, so much to offer. She had never dreamed that she would actually be able to go there. So she was in. She said, that's great, when are we going? Now this discussion was occurring around the New Year's, and Jim would like to depart to Istanbul as soon as Irene gets done with her school session in the late spring. They discussed the dates, she checked the calendar, and now he has a target window for their travels. She also knows that when the school year ends, she has to be ready to go to Turkey. When Jim traveled historically, he would choose destinations where people would speak English. He never tried to learn another language, and he was very comfortable traveling to destinations that were English friendly. Istanbul, being a very large cosmopolitan city, accommodated him very well. He liked to stay at the Hilton Parksa Hotel in Machka. The reason he liked that hotel was a funny reason. A friend of his had explained to him that that hotel was frequented by spies during the Cold War. And he didn't know if these stories were true or not, but it gave him an interesting picture of a dimension of Istanbul that he'd never really considered. He realized that Istanbul is where East meets West, and that even though he didn't know if the spies frequented the Hilton Parksa Hotel, the story was plausible enough for him to enjoy it. Machka is a very nice place to stay, and there are lots of things within easy walking distance of the hotel. So his plan was to stay in the Parksa Hotel. Now, Irene had never done international travel except for her travel with Jim. But her background was different because Irene is an educator. So she is very disciplined in learning new information because she had to do that every year so that she would be expert enough on the subject that she would have something to teach to the children. So having a 6-month lead time for her trip to Istanbul was perfect because she could study and she could learn and she could prepare. Irene realized that she knew nothing about the Turkish language. She knew nothing about Turkish cuisine. So she had a lot to learn. She went to the bookstore and she went to the language section and saw a bunch of resources for learning languages, but couldn't find anything on Turkish. She went to the help desk in the bookstore and asked if they could make a recommendation. The lady at the help desk was familiar with this problem. She said, sure. If you're traveling to Turkey, you might want some polite phrases. You can't learn the language in 6 months, but you can learn a lot of polite phrases to make your travel easier and perhaps safer. I would recommend a series that we have that includes 2 audio tapes and a booklet, and that will teach you a bunch of polite phrases so that you'll be much better off. Let's go take a look. They went to the shelves and she found that series of traveler's courses, but the one for Turkish was not present. She said, I can handle this. I'll just order it. It'll be in a couple of days. So Irene was in. She paid for the course and expected it would be delivered promptly. Several days later, she went back to the bookstore and picked up her language course for polite phrases in Turkish. She had been thinking about whether she would share this with Jim, or maybe this would be just her little surprise. She hadn't decided, but she did realize that the trip is 6 months away. She doesn't have to decide today. She also went to the library at the school and found a couple of books about Turkey. Not much. So she went to the public library in town and found a lot more. There were some reference books that she could not check out of the library, but there were also some books she could. So she availed herself of the information in the library, and she started listening to the audio tapes of the phrases in Turkish. She listened about 30 minutes a day, and so far she has not disclosed this plan to Jim. The total time on the audio tapes was about an hour and a half, and so she went through those tapes over a period of months, dozens of times. She got to where she could say the words before they were said on the tape. She knew the tapes so well. She looked at the booklet as well. It all made sense. After a few months, she looked in the telephone directory, the yellow pages, and she found a Turkish restaurant in town. So at lunchtime, she went there and was seated by the owner, hostess. Very few people worked at that restaurant, and it was quiet at lunchtime. So in the dining area, there was the lady who greeted her, who functioned as the hostess, but also as the server. And there was someone in the back in the kitchen making the food. When Irene got there, she was given a menu and she started looking it over and realized that she had no idea what this food was. Now, the menu had the Turkish name and the English name, but she still didn't know what these dishes were. Some of the stuff looked a little familiar. It reminded her of Greek food, stuffed grape leaves, for instance. She recognized the hummus, and in the desserts, she recognized the baklava. When the owner came to take her order, she said, you know, I just don't know this cuisine. I'm going to Istanbul in June, and I'm here because I want to learn. I'm trying to learn. The lady smiled broadly. She said, I can help you. They went through the menu, and by comparing the pictures of the food and the names in English and the names in Turkish, she narrated the menus so that Irene would better understand what was being served. She recommended something to have for lunch and took that order. When the food was ready, she brought it out and served it to Irene and said in Turkish, "May it do you good." But she said it in Turkish, and Irene was surprised. She recognized the sounds. And they briefly discussed the proper response, which is bless the hands. And again, this sounded familiar. These were in her phrases. Irene loved the food and found this very helpful, very comforting. Over the months, she returned to the restaurant a number of times and tried a variety of the foods, becoming more familiar with the traditional cuisine of Turkey as served in this restaurant. When it was time for them to leave for Istanbul, they packed and prepared and departed on their flight. It was a long flight. They had to connect in Europe, but eventually they found themselves in Istanbul. A long taxi ride took them into their hotel, and indeed they arrived at the Hilton Parksa Hotel in the Machka section of Istanbul. On the ride to the hotel, Irene was watching through the window as this very unfamiliar, interesting scenery flashed by her. They were very tired from their long trip, so they just got a light dinner at their hotel and turned in early. After breakfast, Jim summoned a taxi and off they went to explore Istanbul. By lunchtime, Irene was feeling pretty good. She was not overly tired from their travels, and she was very excited about being in this exotic location. They went down to the area around the Blue Mosque and the Hagia Sophia, and they walked around and took in the sights. Pretty soon it was time for lunch. A couple of streets over, they found a small restaurant, and Jim was satisfied that the menu was in Turkish and English so that he'd be able to navigate. The waiter took their order, and Jim was impressed at how decisively Irene selected her food. She seemed to know what she was doing. Soon the food came and was served to them at their table. The waiter in Turkish said, "May it do you good." But in Turkish, Irene answered him, "Bless the hands." This astonished the waiter, but also Jim. Where did she get this? How did she know how to say that? They were both astonished. The waiter commented to her how lovely it was that she took the time to learn that phrase, how polite it was. Jim asked her how she knew that, and she said that she studied a few polite phrases. At the end of the meal, they were very satisfied. Jim paid the bill, and they went to depart. The waiter bid them goodbye, and Irene turned to the waiter and in Turkish said, "Thank you very much." "Çok teşekkür ederim," she said. The waiter broadly smiled. This lady is super cool. Over the rest of their trip in Istanbul, they visited a bunch of very interesting places, and Irene looked for places to, with a very light touch, use the Turkish she knew to be polite and have some fun. Each time she came up with a phrase that was used appropriately and produced positive results, Jim was just proud of her. This was just super cool. Owing to Jim's good-natured approach to travel and Irene's tremendous sweetness and politeness, not to mention the remarkable hospitality of the Turkish people, the trip was outstanding. At the end of the trip, it was time to pack to return. And Irene reflected that although she really enjoyed this opportunity and this experience, that she did have a sensation deep inside her that it was time to go home. She had a little bit of yearning to return to the comforts of home. That's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. We encourage comments below. I hope you join us in future videos. See you soon.